Good afternoon and most welcome to 907 of the Heidegger series. And we are currently recording here in Trädgårdsföreningen, that very lovely city park. And it's fantastic to see that every new day we're here, there are new things. I should actually take a photo on that, carefully. There are new wondrous creatures and things springing up. And I think also, Kalle, you should sort of hide your sandwich. Even those creatures are very lovely, they are also sort of greedy. Greediness is not what I'm going to talk to you about today. I will talk about the penultimate or third before now, when we talked about friends in the perspective of Derrida. We had a singular sentence, and it turned out that self-identity that I thought was there from the beginning turned out to be massive in meaning, and not only the reverse meanings but other meanings that could not be extracted from the first superficial take. And my superficial take was if you have everyone as a friend, you have no one as a friend. But it turned out to be much deeper than such. And this goes to show that something that I thought was identical to itself in many years was something that was not even identical to itself. Now I would like to turn the tables. Instead of looking at the multitudes of meaning, like in the sentence we mentioned before, the example coming from Derrida and his philosophy of friends, let's take a look at identity. Could the reverse be the case? That identity will suffering from the opposite thing? In the first example, the first take was that everything was identical. That could be the case in general with identity. And our neglect of seeing the depth might be the cause that nothing is now identical. And that's danger I was thinking about. It has been mentioned before, but not to that extent. A lot of things in our everyday life, or in my everyday life, sort of assumes identity in words that they mean more or less the same thing, or at least a limited number of things. But something that it doesn't seem to allow many meanings at the very same time. This is something of the reversal of the thing that Derrida suggested. Our current system doesn't seem to allow this. It says where there are many meanings, you have to choose one. And I mentioned before this little story when we had this word omae in Japanese, and it came up to discussion in the linguistic groups, and everyone thought that if you put it in context, those different meanings will sort of clarify and single out to only one, or tops two. Whereas I and a Japanese fellow, Keiko, disagreed. Maybe the meaning is not decided at all. You actually get that feel when you use the word of undecidedness, but at least in contrast to my own language, Swedish. And now I realize that those deans and honorable members of the board in Cambridge who put down the sign non placet, I do not agree, when Derrida was supposed to get his award in 87, I think it was, they had a point, because actually Derrida is undermining their work, or that it could, if there were any point to Derrida, that would actually undermine a lot of the work of philosophers in some dangerous way. So maybe in some way they were actually correct in not agreeing and used their veto to throw out Derrida. Identity doesn't hold. That is what he suggests. And when our words do not mean what we intend them, then it's disaster. And it's disaster for the educational system if meaning becomes one of those viruses that Derrida often describes himself as, entering the text and changing the meaning of the words in unexpected and new ways. Then, all of a sudden, we don't have stability within meaning at all. We have a greater openness. And that would actually undermine at least the ideology in the educational system, which is today centered on that the words only have one definite meaning in some way, at least when taken in context, and if you put in the factors, you are not being too subjective, or you don't read it in a proper way. Actually, I was tricked into this belief. I remember this keenly. It was when the philosophers entered my class. That happened in Swedish, my paternal language. They actually put in a little thing about objectivity, being a fair person, reading something. And it was this young lady, and she had sort of a birthmark on her cheek. And according to the book, there were one more correct description. It's really funny now. She had a birthmark on her cheek, and then you had another description that said, "Oh, she has a fantastic mouche artistically placed on her cheek to make her whole elegance shine out to the perceiver," something of that sort in Swedish. And the third take was, "Oh my God, she has a horrible wart on her face. How can she even walk around?" The two later descriptions were actually deemed to be subjective and not being fair takes on the text. And I realized afterwards this was a soft way of trying to sort of lock the idea of meaning could not escape, that it could not be free, and that very thing could undermine everything that we stand for and are proud of. That was the reason for that little text. It developed a whole chapter, the rest I've forgotten. And it was supposed to help us, to be some sort of aid in learning how to write a correct novel, short stories. I can't see how that would have aided us. I thought already then this is a delineation limitation on fantasy, and only the teacher can try to convince us that one meaning is more correct, but also what she was saying goes for the same thing. Her convincing can have many different meanings. Isn't it Shakespeare that says a woman's no is usually yes? Those things are everywhere. They are abundant. Every time we use language that happens, but we try to ignore it And I think that was the annoyance among these esteemed professors that did this very unusual thing. Apparently it hadn't happened before 50, 60, 70 years. And at that time it was really well deserved. But this time it was just him undermining meaning, nothing else. It is absolutely absurd. What could possibly the objection be? His handling with language is excellent. And even his good translator like Spivak, they are very good. It's a pleasure to read. And a lot of his fantastic handling with language, his correctness is obvious. And that makes it even more absurd where the objection can come from. And I am not trying to defend Derrida here. I would say there is no need for that. It would be absurd to do that, even to try to defend him. More interesting is to understand where on earth were the objections coming from. What little thing in my eyes did they feel to be so threatening? And I would say actually a part that is in common language, in common sense, all the time. We always use this. It's an abundance of multiple meanings all the time, and sayings, especially in my own country, where the term I don't know has so many different meanings, which they don't share in English. Usually they mean no. That can mean a whole alley of ways, and if you're a foreigner, you will be excluded from all those meanings. And to ask the question, what does it mean, doesn't help either, because that will make it worse, limit it to only one meaning. There is an absolute absurdity that a word can have only one meaning. It has to have several meanings at the very same time. And that could be, according at least to Ludwig Wittgenstein, the very foundation of language. Otherwise there wouldn't be a language, nor a world. Nothing would be. And in this spring environment we also noticed that the bees and the wasps are coming out again. And this very garden actually has beehives, so thereby enhancing the chance of pollination for the plants to make them reproduce easier. But also nature has this problem with self-identity. There are many incomposters in nature that use the sign of the wasp, the bright yellow and the black in stripes, that warn potential predators like birds, do not eat me because I will sting you. But there are at least 20 different flies that don't sting but still have the same colors. These are the imposters. Should these have been banned by the noble gentleman at Cambridge as well? Do we have to ban nature in an absolute demonstration of presence? Nature itself could be the enemy. This has actually been suggested by people, no longer today, but in the 18th century it was not unusual among the Enlightenment philosopher to see nature as a threat, because it was unstable and very, very not to be completely self-identical. Let me take some more of this book. I'm getting into it by Tartan Tolko, and it has the same sense that Derrida had in the beginning. I really liked it. I liked the writing style, but many times it felt that the meaning, although it was very smart, very clever, very correct, it meant so little in the real world. You have to remember, as everyone else here in Sweden, I was coming from the domain of presence, and me especially coming from analytical philosophy. But oddly enough, the feeling when the years passed and I went into the text, I tried it out, I practically practiced it. I realized that deconstruction means a lot more than the analytical philosophers, because it invites the radical difference that meaning is dependent on. Without radical difference, meaning is bound to disappear in self-identity in a rather loop-side way. Turning back on itself, it loses the power actually to mean anything at all. We need the radical otherness of nature. Nature is not a scapegoat, and in that sense we are actually a part of nature. In the same way, this writings by Tartan Tulku had until recently meant even less. Very interesting games of words, I thought. Very intellectual, very sharp, but oh my, meaning so very little. Now that is turning as well. I started to realize these questions are incredibly important, and that they have repercussions into the world, into society, into health, into balance, how to be healthy, how to be wholesome, how to be peaceful, harmonious. It is not small things. And whereas I have understood for a long time and denied it that the influence of analytical philosophy in Great Britain itself, from where it stemmed, is incredibly small. They do not partake as French philosophers in televised programs. They are not on the headlines in newspapers. Nobody recite them. They are themselves, by themselves, casted out. So the same ones that have done the casting out have done it to themselves. They are the ones who gave the sign non placet and assigned the function to themselves by neutralizing, or as Rudolf Gachet calls it, nullify one's own language by means of identity. They made themselves tame, meaning nothing, having no influence. And the more they went into the path, the less they meant. And it is this very dwindling down of meaning in the spiral of self-affirmation and consistency and non-paradoxality that makes everything the same, and in sameness meaning disappears. Like the shadow image we see in the water when a little breeze comes in. That's more than enough to take away the image. And a little breeze is more than enough to take away the demonstrators of presence. Because the more they try to enforce it, the weaker it gets. And they are doing it to themselves, no one else. That could be the case that the great deconstructionists never put too much energy into deconstructing analytical philosophers. There's only one exception, John Searle. And I think the reason was that he himself felt the urge of getting closer to philosophy that really meant something. And that could be the reason Derrida took on him specifically. I have a very hard time finding out why he would have done it to Hilary Putnam or Ormond Quine. Let me take a side here. Tartantulco, in a very smooth way, without any exaggerations, show us the working of identity and how we, instead of giving up in the hugeness of identity, that we can enter it and make it work once more. We can have identity when we have several meanings. Yes, it sounds absolutely paradoxical, but the world is in itself a paradox. I would say that is the true nature of anything that is objective, have meaning, and have influence. This exogenous is the very influx of knowledge. Let me take a quote here from page 34. With the self established as the center of experience, a dichotomy at once emerges. The self finds itself to be separated from the objects that it needs to satisfy its wants. From this basic situation arises desire, and momentum directed outward toward possession of what is desired, and from desire comes action. I think this so accurately describes the action of these analytical philosophers. They have within themselves established an unwarranted want, and this is the reason why they persist in trying to establish presence when there is none, and thereby undermining themselves. There is a sort of pre-ontological, I wouldn't call it confusion, but mis-experience, if that is even a word. And they are victim for this mis-experience. But the fantastic thing, by using logic, by using the stricter term of Derrida, because he has always seemed to be, for me, much stricter than ever were the case with the analytical philosophers. They were particularly clumsy when it came to words like identity, sameness, and difference. They were as clumsy as I used to be with this saying, the one who has all friends has none. That was clumsiness, but that was a help for me. By me discovering my own crudeness, how I am biased, that is actually the path for me to understand. Otherwise, understanding won't come to me. And this is the action of this book and more of his other book. They also go into the self and explain from the perspective also from the self why one wants to strive in that direction. And once we understand that, it makes more sense. It's a sort of a psychological, mental, spiritual way of understanding the urge, and that adds a very musty and fleshy explanation, and that speaks to my heart, because I can actually relate to that want. We always happen in that want. Maybe at the end of an article or at the end of the day when we get tired, we always fall into the idea of presence. It is when we are not clear-headed, when we are not that sharp. It is a normal thing to happen every day. And I would say it's a momentarily happening in every instant as well. And this is something also Derrida explained when he took up these different aspects of reversal and reciprocity, and that they can be seen different, but they can also be seen to sort of coerce in some manner, to enforce each other, and making the strength of the said even stronger. And that is one of those most fantastic things. With more meaning it gets stronger, even when trying to have just one meaning. So all that you try to preserve as an analytical philosopher, as me as well, it's on the contrary actually accessible, but not that way that we usually do. Not by aiming directly for presence and locking other things out. That is not the way to go about it. The way to go about it is by inviting both sides. Sorry, there was another sparrow there. Bound up in these subjective patterns, the self works to acquire specific goods available only in the objective realm, using up its mental and physical energy in doing so. As the method for doing this, technology receives special emphasis. And since the technological model for knowledge supports the claims of the self, there is a confirmation. A cyclical dynamic comes into being, stimulating the ever-increasing production and consumption of goods to satisfy the needs of the self. A constant busyness makes it unlikely that other forms of knowing can arise. And this is when you are absolutely engaged in the world, something that Heidegger often mentions. When we are obsessed, well, obsessed maybe it's a strong word, but when we are a little bit too engaged in the world, this is the time when we are intentionally almost, or in a way unconsciously seeking presence. And it's coming from the lack that we are not present. There is an original lack always there, and the presence becomes a supplement, and then it will stay a supplement. It is not until it actually enters and comes in interaction with yourself that you can have presence, objectivity, identity, and so forth. But as long as you put in a distance, that starts the craving. You are not in with the things. It's like it's a very hot day and you have a sort of philosophy that tells other people, supporters, we should get close to the sea. But you do it at the wrong point, where there are cliffs that are so tall you cannot enter the sea. And then you start to talk more and more about the sea. And the more you talk about the sea, the more you get stuck on this particular cliff. And this busyness of the talk, of the philosophing, in the case of the analytical philosophers and regular man when he's obsessing about things, makes it very hard for the real world, the radical otherness, to properly enter, so you can actually interact with difference. So this is a most positive thing, and I think it is also There's another thing that struck my mind, is that all of a sudden could also be the thing that deconstruction is much easier than analytical philosophy. That has actually struck my mind, because it's coming from experience. And since we all have experience, that would mean that it in some way can be translated to regular language. That's the most interesting thing. We know Derrida, he takes on and helps us analytical philosophers and logicians, but he takes it on with our specific language. It is directed towards us, or people who immerse themselves in literature or politics like Karl Marx, or architecture and so forth. They are all specific areas. And therefore, of course, deconstruction that doesn't add anything, it doesn't translate, it enters the text, is going to take the shape of that specific text, and thereby becoming complicated. But what I've been thinking for myself, maybe that is not a necessity. And I would even make it stronger. I have a very strong feeling that that is not a necessity. Could not be more positive. I think it's better to round up here. I say thank you very much from the part of Trädgårdsföreningen, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.